suppose it's leading with compassion in a way. I think seeing the human there and not just kind of labeling that human as an addict and then just seeing the addiction and just the label, which I think we can do with mental health a lot. We might label the person rather than see that there's a human being underneath there.
Welcome everybody to the Build Smart Blueprint. I'm really excited today to have Dan on the podcast. So Dan Bains from Real Talk Support. So Dan has a decade of experience working within the mental health space, working with people, primarily adults, that have had struggles in some area of mental space and that mental health, and that is what we're going to kind of delve into a little bit today. Dan has a specialism in particularly working with adults that have anxiety, addiction issues, depression, a lot of topics, a lot of wide spectrum of things, but today we decided that we're going to kind of hone in on the addiction space. Before we get into that, one thing I did want to add about you, Dan, when I was thinking about what I would like to say to introduce you, is something that has always stood out in any communication we've had is, and your name actually fits it real, is you feel very real. We were supposed to have this podcast, I think on Monday or last week, and you hit some traffic and it just wasn't the right vibe for you. And I loved that it was like, okay, cool, it's not right, let's just reschedule. And I think often when you're talking to professionals and someone in a kind of therapy space, there's a pressure for that person to be very rigid and to be kind of like solid. But actually, I found that any communication I've had with you so far, it's always been like there's no boundary, there's no kind of like barrier. Sorry, that's the word I would use. And I really feel that. And so, I'm sure people, when they listen to this, will want to find out more, and we'll get to, how they can communicate with you. But highly recommend, Dan, you yourself as a LinkedIn follow, because some of the content you put out there in terms of like how open you are about your own story, really good. So really happy and really welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Glad to be here, man. That was a lovely intro.
Yeah, amazing. So as I said, like I wanted today to focus in on the kind of addiction topic, but really with a lens of a construction company owner and how they can kind of navigate that within their business. And obviously there's a whole topic of, someone as an individual suffering from addiction, but I actually wanted to kind of start this conversation and mainly focus this conversation more on a construction company owner that maybe has team members that are, suffering from some level of addiction, or just it's a very prevalent thing in our industry of construction. So can we kind of start off with like just talking a little bit about yourself and your experience within dealing with people with substance abuse addiction, how you found yourself kind of gravitating towards that as a topic?
Yeah. So early on in my career, it was spent as a support worker. That was working out in some of the most deprived communities in Birmingham, and it was with clients with a lot of complex needs. Could have been severe mental health conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar, individuals that didn't really have the coping skills to manage. They struggled a lot, and a lot of them would end up in addiction too. So a lot of my work was around supporting those individuals. It was quite intensive support, so we'd give like 4 hours a week of support to each individual. So we were really there kind of in the trenches, it felt like, helping them in the community. And then I kind of progressed into working as a therapist, and a lot of the clients that I've kind of gravitated towards myself have been ethnic minorities. I've been quite a lot of the majority male as well. I think what does help is my own kind of journey as well. So I grew up in a house with addiction. I've had a lot of family members that have gone through addiction, some still going through it, and I have a few that are in recovery. I myself had some difficulties with substances and found support through a charity in Birmingham called Change Grow Live. And it's interesting that we're going to be talking about employers and how they can support, because my employer at the time actually gave me the space in my work day to go to meetings with a caseworker, which helped me work through my own issues with substance misuse. That then led me to being referred to a therapist, and then I was like, once I'd found out that that could be a vocation, that kind of started me on the path towards training myself, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting journey, and there's always a level of value, and I think gravitas around when you're speaking to somebody that's kind of lived it from both ends, especially when you're talking from a kind of counselling and therapy perspective. I understand this might be a bit of a generalised question, and obviously we're trying to cover quite a heavy and wide topic in a very short period of time. But when it comes to substance abuse in itself, is there a very different ways that one could deal, and deal is probably not the word, but approach, let's say, the matter, depending on the type of substance that is being abused, if that makes sense? So if we took one end of the spectrum of maybe weed and alcohol, and then the other spectrum of, let's say, your kind of harder drugs like heroin or something like that, is the approach different, especially again from a perspective of somebody that's trying to help, somebody that's trying to kind of intervene, stuff like that?
It's a good question. I think as you said that, I thought about the amount of kind of harm that can be inflicted, or the amount of consequence is probably the better word. Someone smoking cannabis very heavily is going to have a bit less of a consequence than someone who's using heroin or cocaine. Simply is going to be a different amount of cost, kind of health implications as well. So you might need a different kind of wraparound support for those different addictions, I guess. And I think working with addiction, it's anyone could sit there and say, just stop. That's not what I get paid for. The key work is around finding out why the addiction is there in the first place, and it's working with the kind of the underlying factors to it. So say if we use the kind of top drawer example of someone who copes with stress by drinking excessively, the work might not be actually about quitting alcohol. It might be about finding ways to reduce their stress, and then in essence, by reducing their stress, building up ways for them to cope with stress and manage stress in their life, we would expect that the alcohol would subside, rather than kind of tackling the alcohol first. That person hasn't learned how to cope without it, so we need to build that before we can get to that.
And would you say that's kind of like the premise or the basis of any kind of counselling or therapy you're doing with somebody, particularly in substance abuse, is actually, from what I got there, is understanding more of what is the cause of that person needing that substance, and working more on unpacking and resolving that. Is that kind of like the basic framework that you would typically follow with any
it's
new person that you...
Yeah, I think it's an essential part of the work. We need to find out what that addiction is giving that person in their life. What is it helping them to cope with? You might have heard people call alcohol a crutch before, And if we have a physical ailment, a crutch is there to support us to stand. So in essence, we can see that that substance is there to support that person in some way. So we can't just remove it because then they'd fall down. So it is figuring out why it's there and how can we kind of build that person's way of coping, their inner strength, as a way to then not need the crutch. So in essence, it's kind of like if you were healing a physical wound, they wouldn't need the crutch to keep them up anymore. And it's kind of doing that on an emotional, psychological level.
So something interesting that you said a moment ago was this idea of like just stop. And I've certainly been in situations myself, you know, both professionally and in my personal life. Like, you know, it's not that uncommon that I'll have people talking to me for advice or talking to me for guidance and things like that. And I've had a few situations where, you know, somebody is suffering with some sort of addiction. And for me, as somebody that you know doesn't actually have anything like that, and sometimes finds it a bit hard to relate, the natural thing when you don't relate is just like, well, just logically it doesn't make sense. You're saying you don't want this, but you're doing this, and it's just like, well, just stop. And I can really think, you know, others in that kind of owner hat, the kind of construction company owner hat, that somebody's coming to them, or they can see that somebody's, you know, abusing themselves for substances, that there's this kind of like tendency to just say, oh, well, just stop. So my question was actually like around that, do you kind of generally advocate that when you're in those situations, it's better to let that conversation be had with like the professional? So the role of somebody like myself is to encourage them to seek professional help? Or do you think actually, you know, we as owners and operators of businesses, if we're talking from an employee kind of concept, should actually get involved a little bit more in the weeds and actually do some of what you're saying about exploring why are they going for those substances?
I think it could, if someone felt able to kind of upskill themselves in a way that they could kind of develop the ability to have that conversation with someone. And I think it's important not to kind of further push them into feelings of shame, kind of guilt, judgment, because then that can kind of further drive the cycle of addiction. And I think when I see someone going through an addiction, I see a human being in pain. And if I remember that, then it's hard for me to sit there and judge that person. And I've never met someone that wanted to be addicted. No one wants to be addicted. It's not like part of human nature. It's not how they want to live their life. It's there because sometimes it's there because it's keeping them alive in a way. That person without that substance abuse might have committed suicide. It might be the only lifeline that's there for them. So I suppose it's leading with compassion in a way. I think seeing the human there and not just kind of labelling that human as an addict and then just seeing the addiction and just the label, which I think we can do with mental health a lot. We might label the person rather than see that there's a human being underneath there. And I think that in itself, kind of being a mindset shift, will change how you approach someone in a conversation. I don't think you need all the skills in the world to be able to chat to someone human to human, and I think that in itself could provide a level of support that person's not had. They might not have been able to reach out to anyone. They might not have had anyone that would actually sit and listen to their struggle. And even if as a manager that's the the only thing that they can provide, that's something that could be the first step for them to reach out for support. It might let a little bit of steam out where they can then kind of take a further step down the road of getting support. And if managers and business owners had services that they knew of.
Can we delve into that a little bit more? Because I'm curious, like, let's say I'm in a situation where let's say as a fictional situation, I don't particularly feel I've got the skills to facilitate that quick conversation. Okay, so my natural tendency is just to say, just stop. And I know that's not the right thing to say, but I also know, like, I don't know, I'm just too busy, or I'm just like not the good person to speak about. But I want to help this person.
Mm-hmm.
But in construction is one side of it, and the other side of it is a lot of the guys in construction are from kind of ethnic minorities. And so in both of these, as individual sectors, let's say, talking to someone and the idea of therapy and counselling and seeking professional help is like, has stigma associated with it. So how, if you're in that situation, like, how are you still able to help if you know, like, you just saying, you should speak to somebody is not going to land well? Like, what else can you do, if you know what I mean? Like, what are those steps you could perhaps take to encourage or help that person to get them the right help they need?
Yeah, I think therapy is not the only option. I think there are a lot of faith-based programs of support as well. There's a Seek 12-step program that I'm aware of as well. There's a usual kind of Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous as well. Kind of covers all drugs. There's the service I went to, Change, Grow, Live. Theirs was more kind of psychology based, neuroscience based, more educating you on what addiction is, how it's occurring in your brain, what's happening in the neurochemistry, and finding ways that you can kind of break that pattern of use. So what I'm saying is, there's a wide variety of services that are available. And like I said, they can be faith-based, they can be for different communities as well. They're kind of tailor-made programs for those specific communities. Just talking from the Sikh community, drinking is probably the largest issue, alcohol use in my community. As a result of that, the third sector charity organisations have put in place services that can provide kind of specialist and tailored support for those people, even in their own language as well. They might struggle to relate to someone speaking in English, so finding someone that can speak their language. And they're usually led by people that have gone through it themselves, and like you said at the start, that can kind of provide a lot of hope for people. So there is a variety out there.
On the topic of like, as you said, with particularly around culture, certain cultures can have tendencies towards certain substances, but also, I think, from my own experience as well, tendencies to, let's say, use alcohol, like drink in certain situations, or like use certain vices in different ways, let's say, or even culturally approach or see certain substances in different contexts. In a lot of companies, like, as you grow your business, like when you start off, what I've found is in construction, usually the guys you end up employing are from the same ethnicity as you. That, you know, if you go back, you know, like, so some of the starting Indian builders, like all the guys on site will be Indian, Polish, same. Like, it's like that. But then as you grow, you know, you sort of maximize your personal network, and then you start needing to employ people from different cultures. And I'm curious, like, what one could do if, let's say, they have a team member from a different culture to them. suffering, they believe, from some sort of substance abuse, they don't necessarily know, you know, from a cultural point of view, like how that is usually dealt with, and they don't want to say something that might be kind of wrong, or like, you know, how can you deal with that situation, and what steps could someone take to, whether it's upskilling or like, I don't know, finding someone that relates to them, or maybe that's not an issue at all, and just like, oh, maybe I'm overthinking it.
No, I get what you
have
mean.
you got
I
any thoughts on
suppose
that?
if you've developed a company that's all Indian and then starts transitioning to having a lot of the Polish community, and there's a very different mindset around drinking and culture and how men should be as well. My first thought was, if you are starting to branch out, to be proactive in your search of support that is available. So if you do know you're accessing other communities, finding support that is fitting for them and that individual. It could even be having, I don't know, like a therapist or confidential helpline that could kind of be the first port of call, that could kind of triage people for you. That might be useful. So it's kind of outsourcing that skill set to someone else and having them to be the one that can kind of plug people into the right area that kind of works for them.
I think actually something you mentioned there resonates, that I would actually add now, thinking about it in my own experiences, and this is more about, like, I'd say almost long-term preventative, like, stuff, is when you know that your business is starting to branch out from maybe like employing people of your ethnicity that you know really well, is actually taking that time to invest in just understanding the culture of, let's say you've got like 20 Ukrainian guys now working for you, and you've got no idea about the country, no idea about the culture, no idea about the food, no idea about how men are supposed to be. When shit does hit the fan somewhere, you're like a bit lost. But actually, and this is not just about this topic, but loads, is about actually just investing in learning more about the culture, like, beforehand, means that when stuff gets a bit difficult, you can start to understand things more. Like, I know personally, when I initially kind of started engaging more and more, particularly Lithuanians, I always found them to be so rude, and only when I started learning Polish as a language, and I started to understand the grammar around like Polish and how the language is built. And Lithuanian and Polish are not the same, but the way some of these languages are built is that, like, you order your words differently, and you don't have as many filler words as English. So what was happening is, like, on my side, I was thinking, oh, these guys are like just like, yes, no, thank you, give me that. I haven't been paid, like, very blunt. But actually it's because they're doing this a literal translation, right? Because most of these guys haven't had formal English language. They're just you know, so in the addiction kind of conversation, I could so see me having conversation with someone about it and them just being like, no, I'm okay. Like, and it sounds very blunt, but actually, because I'd invested a little bit more in the learning the culture, I could see, okay, that doesn't necessarily mean it's just that he doesn't have the tools to say it in certain language. So let's thingy. So that, what you just said there earlier, just kind of prompted me to share that. I want to, Dan, just kind of ask you a little bit, like honing into a little bit more about construction here. Obviously, you spent a lot of time speaking to people with substance abuse challenges. What do you think it is about construction as an industry, the type of work and stuff like that you think can cause or can cause like there generally to be a higher rate of substance abuse issues? Like, is there a certain dynamic of the industry? Is it the certain type of people it attracts? Is it because I think that's important to kind of delve into, so we as the owners of businesses can kind of understand what what we're kind of creating, and whether that facilitates or actually prevents, these kind of issues.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering about the culture of kind of construction, how that can kind of influence what people might do who work in the trades. For example, it might be very normalised to go to the pub together afterwards and we're all drinking together, finish early on a Friday and then have a big drink up. I think it's quite, from what I can see and what I have known, I've only had a few clients specifically that work in construction industry, but thinking off the top of my head now, literally every night to de-stress, it was alcohol. And then whenever there was a free weekend, which wasn't always, because you guys like to work on weekends as well, it would be a bit more of a kind of blowout session on the weekend. I just wonder how much of that is kind of tied into male kind of stereotypes, culture of males as well, and it being a highly kind of predominantly male workforce as well. I think all of it kind of creates the perfect storm for not talking about mental health, using alcohol, substances to cope with stress, to relax is a lot. I found people find it hard to switch off, especially the business owner as well at times. They're doing a lot of mental gymnastics all the time, and it's a lot of stress to cope, especially if you've got little projects here, there and everywhere, and you've got teams here, there and everywhere. I can't
it is a deadline based kind of delivery usually, where it's kind of very time focused. And I think you mentioned an interesting point there about I think there is a bit of a difference in the kind of office level and management level, and that has certain dynamics again around like constant deadlines and needing to do so much and then suddenly having to switch off. Using some sort of substance can help get there quicker. But then also on the other side is on the site level, there's a lot of physical labor, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of I guess because I've not been on the tools in that way, but if you're like constantly digging or breaking and there's numbness and then you've got to do it the next day, there's often going to need to be some sort of vices to kind of shut off when you have got that short period of time to shut off.
Even physical pain, I wondered about that. It might be people on site are kind of struggling with physical pain, and it might be a way to kind of numb that and then get back to it the next day as well.
Yeah, it's because there's a range of different substances, right? And even to some extent, some of the guys that I used to work with, and this is more on the site level, they used to drink these relentless drinks like tap water, honestly.
Like the energy drinks, kind of.
Yeah, and sometimes I used to look at those things and think, this is normalised because it's legal, but like, you only have to look on the back of those things to see what's in them, and you think like that there must be so much numbing or pain, and you're just on overdrive, like lifting things, drilling things, cutting things. You've got this energy, but it's not real energy kind of thing. And actually, once you pull off it, suddenly you realise there's an addiction there as well. I wanted to ask you, Dan, about how you draw the line, or how you would define whether there is a struggle with addiction, because I think particularly in construction, and particularly in the context of drinking, there's a fine line, and it can be hard to define, like, okay, is that just work drinks? Is that just like socializing? Or is that just is that an addiction? Because a lot of these guys, like, they've built up a massive tolerance to be able to drink a lot. And for most others, you know, to be drinking that much, you couldn't handle that. But for them, they seem to be fine, and they get up the next day and they're like, you know, smashing out whatever it is that they're doing. So how can, I guess my question is like more, how can you see signs that would indicate like a worker is actually struggling with substance abuse and it's something that maybe needs some intervention?
I think that's, as you said that, it kind of reminded me of how individual it can be, and it's kind of, the person needs to define it in themselves if they feel like they're addicted. And the kind of, I suppose, like the textbook understanding of addiction is if you're trying to quit something and you're unable to stop, then that falls into that realm. If, like the person you mentioned, has built a massive tolerance and he's not seeing it as an issue, it doesn't provide him massive negative consequences in his life and he's quite happy to continue, and it's not causing him a negative impact in kind of relationships, his own kind of mental well-being, physical well-being, his family, his work, then although he might be doing, I don't know, 6 pints a night, I couldn't handle it, but if that works for him, then that works for him. But I think on an employer level, if you're noticing change in someone, so it could be that their mood has altered significantly, I think having your ears open to events that are going on in that person's life as well. Imagining someone that's gone through like a relationship breakdown, going through grief. If you're aware that person drinks a lot, and then there becomes an event that can make them susceptible to kind of falling into that abuse, then it might be helpful and proactive to actually have a conversation at that point and do it from a place of, I don't know, I feel a bit worried, I just want to check in, is there anything I can do to help? Might help catch it before it becomes something, in a way, if that's possible. Yeah.
I'd really like, Dan, if so one of the things I really, especially when we have kind of guest specialists on our podcast, is to try to extract some real actionables or examples of what to do, like practical stuff. And I think we've talked about, in some senses, when as an owner or an operator helping someone with substance abuse, there's this kind of mental shift of trying to get in their shoes, or trying to see the person behind it, and just kind of like mentally changing yourself to being able to help that person. However, I, from a practical sense, could you give like some specifics of, let's say you've got a team member that you suspect is struggling and you would like to open that conversation up, like, where do you have that conversation? What time is best? Like, do you pull them out of the space? You've already given some nuggets, but what kind of sentences do you use? Like, what are some good phrases? Like, I think that kind of stuff would also really be helpful for our listeners, so they can take it away and feel like, okay, that resonates, that I could do that, let me go and action that.
I think the most glaring thing that came up to my mind was doing it in a confidential space. Naming and shaming in front of people, I can't imagine being very helpful for anyone. So yeah, if you have a confidential space that you can bring them to, if it's if they are able to be, I don't know, if you kind of raise up to another level where you've got a kind of HR team or something like that, if there is someone who has a bit more of the soft skills that could have that conversation, that might be a useful avenue to pursue as well. And it's, like we mentioned, kind of saying it in a way that is humanising, not in a kind of, I think you're drinking too much. It could be, I feel a bit worried about you. I just wanted to check in. Just want to see how things are going. I'm aware that you've gone through a divorce recently. I'm wondering if you've had anyone that you can reach out to for support. Just want to let you know that I'm here if you need. That might help kind of shoe into, there are some resources here available. Might be, I've noticed your mood has changed over the last couple of months. I'm not kind of hearing your jokes as much on site. Just wanted to check in to see how you're doing. It's kind of like the difference between when you ask someone, how are you? And then the difference when you actually look someone in the eye and say, how are you? And you wait. There's a big difference between those two. I think even the latter, even that, how are you actually doing? And having like a sit down space with men as well, it can be more helpful to walk and talk. Men find that more comfortable. Sitting square on can be quite difficult for men to open up as well. Sitting side by side can be helpful. Kind of helps someone to feel like you're there with them, rather than if you're sitting there as manager opposite them in your big chair, it becomes a bit frightening to speak. So yeah, it's kind of finding a way to lower your authority if you can and kind of meet them on a level. Yeah, I hope that's provided some insight.
I think really useful, and in some way I think it kind of goes in a full circle, because now I noticed the questions you ask match the mindset that you're sort of encouraging us to take, which is, don't focus on the actual. The mindset piece was like, don't look at what the substance is, look at the step back of what that's causing. And the language you're using is, again, don't focus on like, oh, you drank this much this day. It's actually like, okay, what's that creating, or what could be the cause of that, and focus more on that, which I think is a really good lesson, because it kind of like starts to build the picture of like how you could be approaching that sort of topic. When it comes to environments that an employer can create to foster like positive communication and positive, like, I don't even say positive, I want to almost say like a safe environment where a team member could feel like they would be comfortable sharing that. Can you give any tips both on your personal experience and also your experience of working with clients? Like, what kind of things do you think an employer can put in place in construction particularly to make somebody that maybe becomes self-aware they've got some substance abuse challenges feels like, yeah, actually I feel comfortable speaking to my manager, to the boss about this? Like, what can you think of anything that, again, from a practical point of view, or maybe a mindset point of view, that can create an environment like that within your firm?
Yeah, I think I don't know how realistic it is, but if there was a space where it's like kind of man to man, can we have a conversation off the book, and this kind of stays between us, that is another way of me saying having a confidential space with someone, knowing that it stays there, that might help someone to open up. I suppose it can be a challenge for business owners as well. I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate, I guess. There is safety critical work as well, so then that kind of is difficult. But if they could put some kind of safety measure in place, because I think one of the biggest barriers I can imagine for someone to feel able to speak would be, I'm scared of losing my job, scared of losing my work. So if as an employer there's any kind of safety that you can provide around that level, like, look, I don't want to get rid of you. I want to help you through this, and this is what I'm willing to do. I need you to meet me halfway. Seems reasonable. Because I understand as well as a business owner, it's a business that they need to run at the same time. So it's got a kind of, if they're willing to provide some support, then someone needs to be willing to kind of take it as well. But yeah, I think having confidential space, providing a bit of kind of job security, that's what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way. What else might help? Something I know that bigger firms do is they have someone that's mental health first aid trained. Something like that could provide, on a site level, it could provide a go-to person, and that might kind of be a bit of an easier space for them to speak to, rather than having to go all the way up. And then it might kind of get supported at that level, and that's all they need. Obviously there is further up high level support if they do need that, but that could be a way of kind of upskilling employees as well, or even as a business owner, if you were mental health first aid trained, why not?
Yeah, and I think sometimes, because again our listenership is more, I'd say, based on owners and operators that don't have the infrastructure to be able to do that, is they would often dismiss that as a possibility at all. But what I've come to find, actually, especially as I've been exploring this topic on the podcast and speaking to different people, is there's loads of free resources out there, first and foremost, if you don't have the budget. So, Lighthouse Charity, for example, I can think of as one focused on construction. But then also there's the likes of somebody like yourself, where you can outsource that in the same way you would outsource another function in your business, right? Like actually having a specialist on some sort of retainer that could come in and do talks, but also like as and when could speak to somebody within your team and provide that confidential space. And again, going back into this kind of like what we're talking about being proactive, is I think let's say somebody like brought you into their firm to kind of help with that side of things. Is you being a familiar face, jumping on the meeting occasionally, like, or virtually, people seeing your face, they're much more likely to just be like, oh, that's Dan, and like, I'm going to talk to him, rather than, oh, this is just this guy I've never seen before, and now suddenly he's got to sit down to you and talk to you about this particular topic. Exactly. I think one other thing that, so I can share personal experience of particularly what you said about the kind of check-ins towards the end of my ownership of my construction company. I sort of implemented this, I think I did it every 3 months. It was like a check-in, just how you're doing. It wasn't tied to the quarterly reviews. It was just like pure, what do you want to chat about? And it was interesting because different people went different ways. And I would always be supportive in entrepreneurship. So some would want to talk to me about their aspirations to start a side thing, and I'd always encourage that, and it'd be like, oh, okay, cool, like let's just chat in 3 months and let's see where it's at. But having that, loosening it, means that if and when they feel the need to share, you've already, like, it doesn't feel like you only talk about the shit stuff. It's like you just talk about everything, and it kind of creates that. It is, I think, harder to do it if you want to roll that out to like at a site level as well. And obviously there's an investment in that. But I think, again, there's always like middle ground. Some way you can always be creative to try and find a way to facilitate that. The other thing that I wanted to share, and I think, Dan, you do it naturally and you don't probably realise it, is being open yourself and leading by example through that. And I think as a construction company owner, if you're serious about wanting a space not just in substance, but in the whole mental health spectrum of wanting to have a company where people can feel open and they don't feel pressured about not talking about it, is actually talking about yourself and sharing your own struggles and your own stuff, can make, I think, your team feel like, okay, like he's got his stuff, he's dealing with shit as well, like I'm not any different to him.
Like humanizing yourself if they, in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that is something, and obviously you've got to find a balance, and I totally understand, like, when you're also the boss and you're the manager and you're like telling people what to do, you kind of don't necessarily want to show weaknesses as well. But I think there's something in that about kind of opening up and leading, for example. You know, I actually, after I said that word, I was thinking that doesn't resonate. And yes, like courage is a much, and even actually sharing that in that way, like not being, because I think particularly in the space of like mental health, everybody's very particular about, like, got to say this, got to say that, like, don't say this. And I think actually I was talking to a lady from the Lighthouse charity, this mental health charity, and she was talking about this idea that someone from somebody is looking to change the word for committing suicide to like some other word, doing suicide or something like that, and it was just this kind of like this over trying to change things, and it just came off like so unnatural because it was like clearly forced, clearly forced, but actually letting you, like, I'm just thinking this example of accidentally saying weakness, but then not correcting, like, oh no, I meant courage. It's actually acknowledging I said weakness because, like, internally I probably see it as a weakness, but I have the awareness that actually, you know, this is something that can be courageous as well. So all of that, I think there's a lot in that, and obviously it depends on how much you can communicate with your team. So Dan, I loved that conversation. I think it was as I think we tried to keep it as light as we could for quite a deep subject. I would encourage anybody that is struggling with substance abuse or addiction issues to look at some of the links that we'll provide in the show notes. Obviously, we haven't talked too much today about individuals and what they can do in their own circumstances, but I think it would be a good point to ask you, Dan, just to kind of give a little bit of explanation about how you work with clients, how they can contact you as well, as you know, maybe in the context of an employer, or if somebody's actually listening and has these particular challenges themselves and wants to get some help.
Cool. Yeah. So with employers, happy to set up kind of partnerships. So I do have a partnership at the moment with the Complete Health Rewire program. That is a kind of personal training and coaching program, and if there's anything that kind of falls out of the remit of coaching and falls into therapy, then they kind of outsource to me. So similar for construction companies, I'd be happy to kind of provide outsource support. Can even be on an individual session basis, or just kind of getting a block of 6 sessions. Better than most of the EAP lines that people contact that don't really get used and don't really provide any actual change. Even on a business perspective, the kind of cost of having someone leave the business, having to look for someone else, the cost of all that time, if there could have been 6 sessions of intervention with a therapist and you get to keep that person on, I would bet all my money that they'd be a lot more motivated to work for that person who's actually helped them out. So by helping someone else, you're helping yourself. And
I can just to very quickly interrupt. I know of somebody that, without giving too many details, that has done exactly this within their company, supported somebody and has seen a complete transformation, because there's a level of like loyalty and trust
Of
and
course.
value that you know, it's not just about money. So
Yeah, and you'd feel kind of safe to work with that employer, and you know they got your back, and then that's the kind of environment that we can create if we want to. And yeah, on a kind of individual basis, so I work in Birmingham, provide in-person therapy, and I also work remotely, do sessions by video. You can find me on the internet if you just put Daniel Bains in. All my counselling directory profiles will come up, and my website is realtalksupport.com. And yeah, I am available to kind of work with people, happy to work with people, and you'll be able to find my LinkedIn through my website as well. Like JP has said, I do like to be honest and kind of bring my own life experience in, which has kind of led me to get into this space myself. And yeah, don't know where else to go with
I think it's also worth adding, Dan, as well, like your particular experience and emphasis, I'd say, on the South Asian community, because you know each culture, each community has its own specificities, and it's always easier to talk to somebody that can relate. So that's something that's worth adding. So we'll put the links in the description so people can reach out to you. But thank you so much for your time, your openness, your honesty, and your advice. It was a very useful conversation.